Up until now, we've heard hints about this covenant, about this, for lack of a better term, contract, and that's not a better term. Covenant is better. This contract, this covenant between Abram and God. We've heard hints of it. It has been made with God already. But today we really get into the meat of it. What's going on with this covenant? So we're going to take a look at it in chapter 17. And in this chapter, you not only have the covenant, but you have the sign of the covenant, namely circumcision, that's going to come up as well. So let's take a look at this really important, really pivotal chapter in the history of humanity and certainly in the story of Genesis. Let's take a look at it. So Genesis 17, beginning with verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him. 99, let's pause right there. So it's already been a lot of years since Ishmael was born. Ishmael's a teenager now, according to the timeline that we've just seen, okay? He was 85 last time, right? He's 99 now, so it's been some time. If he thought it was going to be hard for him to have kids back then, how much harder is it going to be now, right? It's going to be 99. Wow, okay. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Yikes. Wow. Okay. Let's walk before me faithfully and be blameless. I'm God. Stand right there where I can see every move you make and don't make any mistakes. Really? Is that what's, yeah, that's kind of what he's saying. I am the Lord God Almighty. Walk before me, not behind me, not beside me, before me, in front of me, where I can see you. Walk faithfully and be blameless. Blameless. Perfect. Don't make any mistakes. Wow. Okay. We'll come back to that. Verse 2. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. So, covenant. We're about to describe the covenant that God wants to make with Abram. And every covenant has at least two parts. It has promises and demands. Or here's what one party will do, and here's what the other party will do. As we've talked about before, some covenants were bilateral. That is like a contract today. Two people come together and say, I agree to do this. What about that? There's negotiation back and forth, and they finally land on a spot where they both agree to it. There are other covenants that are unilateral. The person in authority says, here's what you must agree to. For instance, the speed limit is a unilateral covenant. I don't get to negotiate with the police officer whether or not I should stay under the certain speed limit. It's been unilaterally decided by the local authorities that this is the highest speed you can go on this. And the officer comes and says, if you violate it, the officer might give you a ticket and you have to pay a fine. But even in a unilateral contact where one side makes it and the other one has to follow it, even in that, there are benefits to both sides. So what's the possible benefit that I get when they've told me I can't go any faster? The benefit is nobody else can go faster than that either, and the streets are safer. So we're willing to give up the freedom of going as fast as we want for the safety of everybody goes a little slower and everybody drives a little safer, and the enforcement of the speed limit keeps me safe. So even though it's a unilateral contract, the government does it and I don't get to negotiate it, it still has benefits to both sides. Okay, so this is one of those. This is a unilateral contract. Abram is not negotiating with God. God says, I have a contract, I have a covenant I'm going to make with you, and here's how it's going to look. So two parts in promises and demands. The first part that God's going to describe here are the promises in his covenant with Abraham. Here is what I will do. And we're going to see it laid out in the following passage, starting with the middle of verse 4. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. So the first promise that God says I will do to you, Abram, is this. I will make you the father of many nations. Secondly, as proof of that, your name will no longer be Abram, which means exalted father, which kind of was probably felt sarcastic to him living his life, especially getting to 99 without any kids with his wife, at least, right? They had Ishmael, years before that. But even then, it was a long time without being an actual father. To Abraham, the father of nations. So he is by his name now cementing, I'm really serious about this. This is going to happen. He continues on. Verse 6, I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. So the next part that God says I will do for you in this covenant is this: that nations and kings will come from you. Not only are you going to change from being father to father of nations, but there are going to be a whole bunch of descendants, nations, not just nations, but kings as well, are going to come from you. Continues on in verse 7. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. So, two promises in this passage. First of all, the covenant is eternal. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant. It's an eternal covenant. Most covenants or contracts have an end date. God specifically says this has no end date. It is eternal, which means, is it still in in play today? Yes, because it lasts forever. How is it in play today? That's an interesting theological question, but it's still in play today because God said it would be eternal. And he says it will include your descendants. I will be your God, and I will be the God of your descendants after you. He continues on in verse 8. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. So he says, the entire land of Canaan is yours. And oh, there we go, already had it up. The entire land of Canaan is yours. This is why the nation of Israel still today is the most disputed, war torn land in all of history. Both the Jews and the Arabs claim it's theirs as promised by God. To the Jews here, to the Arabs through Muhammad, and in the 700s, I believe it was AD. Okay, as do Christians, because the New Testament says that we are the spiritual heirs of Abraham. So the nation of Israel is is the most pivotal nation on the face of the earth, and it begins here. This is where that begins. This now the challenge becomes, okay, if the promise is eternal, but if we as Christians, and me for instance, I'm a Christian, but a Gentile Christian, not a Jewish Christian. There are a lot of Jewish Christians, but most Christians are Gentiles. As a non-Jew, as someone who is not physically descended from Abraham, what does that mean for me in the covenant? Well, there's a certain part of theology called replacement theology, and I'm not going to be pro or anti, I'm just going to lay it out for you. Replacement theology says that the promise to Abraham and his physical children has now been completely replaced by the promise to Abraham's spiritual children, which includes some Jewish people, but it only includes those who have come to know Christ as Messiah. The challenge with that for me, so I said I wouldn't disagree with it, but I'm going to give you why it's a challenge for me. The challenge with that for me is this: if we as Gentile Christians are part of the new seed of Abraham, it's because we're under a new covenant. There's another covenant that comes along under Jesus that supersedes the covenant with Abraham. It builds upon it, but it takes precedent over the covenant with Abraham. And that covenant with Jesus does not have the land of Israel in its promises. The land is not a part of the promise to non-Jewish Christians. But the original covenant God promised to Abram, he said, would be an eternal covenant. So this is where some of the challenge comes from between theologians, some who believe in replacement theology, that being a physical Jew doesn't matter anymore, that covenant is gone. And others who look at it and go, but that covenant, God says here, we just read it, it would be an eternal covenant. And so it is still in play, even though a newer covenant has come along to enhance it. So the question is, when Jesus says, I came to fulfill the law, does that mean he's keeping the old covenant but adding to it and making it greater? Or is he wiping out the law and starting a brand new one? And that is a theological debate we will have until we get to heaven. And then when we get to heaven, we'll know the answer, but we won't care because we'll all get to bow at the feet of Jesus, and petty theological arguments won't matter so much anymore. So anyway, but that's part of the challenge that happens here. And I wanted to lay that out because I know some of you have those questions. So that lays out for you what God promises he will do for us in his covenant with Abram, or now Abraham. Now let's take a look at what God demands in his covenant with Abram, or as I put it as Abram because at the beginning of stating the covenant, he's called Abram, even though the covenant changes that. Okay. All covenants, all contracts require something from every side. Like I said before, even the ones offered unilaterally. So this side of that covenant, what God says, if I'm going to give all of this to you, I need to get something from you. And here's what God says he's demanding from Abraham. Verse 9. Then God said to Abraham, as for you. So how do we know that this is what Abraham's supposed to do? Because God starts it by saying, now, as for you, okay, here's what I'll do. As for you. In other words, I know what I'm going to do. Here's what you have to do as your part. Okay. Verse 9. As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for generations to come. What God is saying is, I'll keep my side. I'll be trustworthy. You can rely on that. You got to keep your side, and your descendants have to keep your side as well. This is always where the problem lies. The problem is never, God, why didn't you fulfill your promises? He always does. The problem is always that we don't fulfill ours. And when we don't fulfill our side of the covenant, then there are consequences in the covenant that we have to bear because of that. So let's take a look at some of this. Verse 10. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. All right, pause. Now, point one, doesn't say point one, but now he comes to point one. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Wow, really? First thing, right out of the gate? Yes. Right? Every guy listening to this has got to be at some point be going, can we at least warm up to that part? I mean, my goodness, really? First thing? Yeah, that's the first thing. Let's take a look at some of the details about it now, shall we? Verse 11, you are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised. That's why Jews still circumcise on the 8th day, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring. So he's going into detail. If you're in the land and you're male, you're going to be circumcised on day 8. Verse 13, whether born in your household or bought with your money, even if they're slaves, they must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. This is why even when Jesus came in, and even after Jesus died and rose again and ascended into heaven and the early church began, the first big theological conversation in the early church was about circumcision. And now you get an idea of why it's so important. You can see how important God makes it here. It's a strong language closing all the potential legal loopholes you might want to bring in. But what about? All those what abouts are gone. All the loopholes are closed. Everybody, if you're a guy, you're getting circumcised. Okay. So what he first says is this: circumcision is the sign of the covenant, not a sign, not one of the signs. It is the sign of the covenant. This is why to this day, circumcision is still so important to the Jews. One of the most important ceremonies they still have is the bris, where on the 8th day after a boy is born, they bring in a rabbi and they have a big celebration and they have circumcision. Okay. You'll note it's not the command. It's not the command of the covenant. It's the sign of the covenant. It's the signature on the bottom of the contract. All right. So it's the sign of the covenant. This proves that I'm serious about keeping my covenant. So what that means is getting circumcised by itself does not mean, okay, I'm good with God. It is like the signature on the bottom of the page that says, I will do the things on the page. We still haven't gotten to what's on the page. We're just saying, this is how you're going to sign the page. This is the sign of the covenant. So how does this apply today? Well, it applies to us only if you're under this covenant. For Jews today, there are still Jews who believe they should follow this, and I don't have an argument with them. I don't think they shouldn't do so. I don't think you need to anymore because the new covenant by Jesus has superseded that, and it doesn't include the land, and the new covenant under Jesus doesn't require circumcision. But if you want to be a faithful Jew, and as a part of that be an observant Jew religiously, it's still important for them to get circumcised. Okay. And again, like I said, this was really the first argument of the early church. The first argument of the early church was over circumcision, but the actual argument beneath the circumcision argument was this: do you have to become a Jew to become a Christian? And if so, then you have to become circumcised to become a Christian. But the early church, through the Apostle Paul primarily as its main arguer, said, no, you do not have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. Therefore, you do not have to be circumcised in order to become a Christian. Right? This is for the first covenant with the physical seed of Abraham. Okay, so that's just the sign of the covenant so far. It continues. Verse 15. God also said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. So, what does this name change mean? Well, first of all, Sarai means my little princess. Sarah simply means princess. Sarai is diminutive. It's like a little girl's name. It's like a father will still say to a 2 or 3 year old, "Oh, my little princess." Sarah means, oh, she's the princess. When she passes by, you better bow. She's royalty. Okay. My little princess is diminutive and possessive. Someone else is calling her that as a loving but diminutive, smaller form. Princess is a possession she owns for herself and gives her a position of authority. Okay. So it goes really from a nickname to a title, is really what happens here. Basically, what she's saying is you're becoming your own person here. You have a say in this as well, which is very, very unusual in this day for a woman to be given that kind of authority and to be given that kind of a voice in a covenant that would happen between God and her husband. But that's God giving her a position in this covenant. It's not just for men, it's for the women as well. Verse 16, I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. So Sarah is central to the covenant. Kings of people will not just come from you and your seed, Abram, but will come from Sarah as well. As we've established last week already, he already made that stupid mistake of taking Hagar and having Ishmael through Hagar. And God goes, no, that's not the baby I'm talking about, because Sarah is a part of this. And this does not involve Sarah. Sarah matters in this. She receives her own blessing and her own place in the royal lineage. Sarah is not just an extension of her husband. Abraham's side of the covenant isn't all that there is. Sarah has a part in it as well. In fact, we'll jump ahead for a moment here to give you a little bit more about this covenant, because it's not all laid out just in this chapter. So let's jump ahead a little bit. Genesis 18:19 also says this, and I believe no, I didn't put it on here for you. Genesis 18:19 says this, I have chosen Abraham that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham all that he has promised him. So also part of the covenant, but from the next chapter, is that we are to act with righteousness and justice, and that we are to teach our descendants to do the same. So it's not just a sign of, hey, we got our names changed, and now I got to get circumcised. It's about acting with righteousness and justice. It's about teaching your descendants to act with righteousness and to act with justice. And note that in this verse, God is saying, this is what allows God to fulfill his promise to us. This is what I demand of you so that I can give you the blessings that I want to give you. And then if you add to that, remember how the whole chapter started? I told you we'd come back to that. Genesis 17:1, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. That's actually a part of the covenant. Part of Abraham and Sarah's and their descendants, part of the covenant is they're to be faithful and they're to be holy. And holy is a huge, huge word in the Old Testament, and a huge, huge word for faithful Jewish people today. Holiness simply means separation. We think that holy means something kind of spooky or whatever. No, holy means separate from. It means this thing doesn't touch that thing. It's holy unto itself. It exists in its own little bubble by itself. That's holy. Set apart is what that means. He says, I want you to be set apart. I don't want you to be like the nations in the land that you're going to. I don't want you to take on their habits and their sins and their ideas and their philosophies and their religions. You're going to, for generations, you, my people that we know today as the Jewish people, will always be different from everybody in the land around them. And we look around today and we see the same thing. You can go anywhere in the world where there's a large Jewish population, and they will almost always be concentrated in a community of their own, and their behavior will be different. Their ceremonies will be different. Their rituals will be different. Often their language will be different. they're set apart, they're holy, they're different, they're separate, they're not the same as everybody else. And that's not something that they look at as a burden to carry. They see it as an honor that God has given to them. Be faithful and be holy. So, the essence of the covenant is righteousness, justice, faithfulness, and holiness. The essence of the covenant is not circumcision. That's the signature on the bottom of the page that says, I will do the covenant. So, circumcision is the promise that I will behave with righteousness, that we as a community will have a community that's based on justice, that we will have a community based on faithfulness to God, and that we will be holy, we will be separate. Even when the other cultures around us go their own way, we will behave correctly. This, of course, as you can see, as today, as spiritual heirs of Abraham, is a part of what we're still supposed to do. So, so is the first covenant completely done away with? No. When Jesus said he would fulfill the Old Testament, this is what he's talking about. He's not talking about the ceremonies, about the food you can or can't eat, or about circumcision. That's not what he's talking about. Those things, or even the land of Israel, those things applied to the original covenant with Abraham. But the long-term eternal covenant does still apply to us today. Righteousness, justice, faithfulness, and holiness. The Bible says way more about those things than it says about almost all other subjects. As a result of this, verse 17 says this: Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Because remember, he's 99 now. By the time the son is born, he's going to be 100. So his response to this amazing covenant is, oh, please, I'm too old for that. Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? He's 99, she's 89. By the time they bear the child, they'll be 190. Not 190, they'll be 90 years old and 100 years old, respectively. And I get why he looks at that and goes, that's crazy, right? And Abraham said to God in verse 18, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Didn't we learn last week that that doesn't work, that that's not God's desire? Everything he said today in this chapter has been really apparent. This is about your physical seed. You're going to have another son. This is not about Ishmael. But I kind of get it, because what God's telling him is going to happen is, quite frankly, impossible. Which again goes back in our entire study to the first few words. What? In the beginning, God. That's why those four words matter so much. Because if this book did not begin with in the beginning God, then we'd read this story and I'd close the book and go, that's stupid. That's a dumb fairy tale. I'm going to read something that makes sense. The only reason this makes sense in this chapter is because back at the beginning, we started with in the beginning God. God can do what only God can do. But he says, oh yeah, it's got to be Ishmael. You must mean Ishmael, right? Verse 19, here's God's response. Then God said, yes. In other words, yeah, okay, Ishmael's going to have some kids. But your wife, Sarah, will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. Different kid, different name by a different person. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But you'll notice it's not everlasting. It's not eternal. They have died out. Verse 21, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. Again, as we talked about earlier, this is not we talked about last week, this is not the beginning of the Arabs, right? That was claimed by Muhammad as a way of making him look like he had Abraham's blood, and he didn't. The Arabs come from the Canaanite tribes that they're about to go in and take the land of, and so it's a totally different situation. Okay, sorry about that. I got distracted for a second. I'll come back and we'll pay attention as we close this chapter out. Verse 22. When he, God, had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael, and all those born in his household or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them as God told him. Abraham was like, okay, if I'm going to take you seriously, we got to get this thing started now, because I'm 99 and time's a wasting. We're circumcising everybody today. Verse 24. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and his son Ishmael was 13. So, right, we talked about it already, a passage of time since the previous chapter. Verse 26, Abraham and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day. And every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or bought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. So we conclude it by seeing that Abraham's immediate obedience is a constant example to us. We'll see it later on as well with the crazy story we're still a couple chapters away from, where God then asks him to sacrifice this son Isaac after he's born. And he does the same thing immediately. He proceeds to do that obedience. So when you take a look at Abraham, and we are not yet done with seeing Abraham's mistakes. We saw one last week. We're going to see a couple more. His mistakes and sins do not mean that he has been taken, the covenant will be taken away from him, because he asks for forgiveness. He repents. And when he is obedient, he's extraordinarily obedient. He steps up in faith in ways that, quite frankly, most of us, including me, probably would not be able to do. So his immediate obedience needs to be a constant example to us. So we're going to see his immediate obedience again in a couple weeks. But for next week and for our next chapter, for sure, we are getting to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I told you we'd get to that earlier, and we only got a quick intro to Sodom and Gomorrah. Next week in our next episode, that story happens. And we're going to find out that Sodom's sins are not what you expect they were, and are exactly what you expect they were. Both. Yeah, I know that's a mystery, just giving you a tease. So you'll come back next week. That's one you are definitely not going to want to miss. We're going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and all of that mess. It's going to be at least PG-13, maybe R-rated. It's some tough language in that passage, but it's important for us to understand exactly what's happening there and not the misperceptions we've often been led to believe. So we'll see you next week.